If you had just 1 hour to say something that would save a life, what would you say? I want to begin by giving my personal thanks to Peter Steinfeld, Jonathan Ehrlich here over at Buena Vista University for making possible this opportunity to address you. Tonight's topic on human trafficking is something that we generally shy away from in polite society. So this sort of forum is necessary for counter-trafficking activists to educate people. And for that, I want to thank you all very much for coming. My profound gratitude goes out to my friend Matthew Friedman, the former director of the United Nations Interagency Program on Human Trafficking in Southeast Asia, and who's currently working at the Mekong Club. Daniel Walker and his team at the rescue organization of Invader, the UNIAP and their staff, the Women and Children's Shelter Hagar International, and the staff at Worldwide Documentaries who produced Not My Life. I thank all of them for their material and inspiration that they have provided to make this lecture possible. This presentation is dedicated to them, their staff, and most especially the people they help. So before I dive in, I'd love to see a quick show of hands. How many of you know what human trafficking basically is, that it is modern slavery, and that it happens all over the world, etc.? Okay, so we'll go with that start. After this presentation, I'd love to hear how some of you got to be concerned about this subject, because one of the questions I inevitably get asked is, how in the world did I ever become involved with it? And to that I would say, be careful if you ever try to write a book. You never know what doors that will open. A few years ago I started one. The plot line involves slavery. Being the sort of person who likes to make things realistic and to make sure everything looks right, I did some serious research into human trafficking. I was completely unprepared for what I found. So up until then, I had had this vague awareness that modern slavery was out there, but I held the same common attitudes that most people do. I figured there wasn't anything that I could do about it. It was a problem for the police. It must be a pretty rare thing, because otherwise I'd hear more about it in the news. And the reality I discovered in my research is that widespread slavery did not end with the Civil War. It is alive and well. In fact, it is found in virtually every country on earth. According to the United Nations, it affects roughly 21 million people at any given time. It is worth $32 billion annually in profits to the criminals. Now, what is modern slavery? Very broadly, it is the loss of personal freedom. It involves physical or mental abuse. Almost always it involves the loss of fair wages. It's a severe crime. You can think about it this way. We get upset at being held up by airport security or in traffic for half an hour. We feel sad or angry if somebody calls us names or hits us. We get really mad if someone steals our wallet or purse. Slavery is much worse than this. Imagine a life where you lose your freedom to leave a situation you don't like. Imagine the stress and fear if you had somebody threatening to hurt you or your loved ones if you didn't do what they wanted you to do. Imagine what it would mean for you to work at a 60, 80, 100-plus hour work week in a lousy job, lousy conditions, mind-numbing, for several months or years and not get paid properly for it, if at all. All those things are a part of slavery today. Just some quick notes before I go on. If at any point you have questions, please raise your hand. I'll call on you at the first opportunity. And for privacy reasons, the imagery here doesn't necessarily show a victim. Names have been changed to protect privacy, but bear in mind that all the elements of abuse in these stories have actually happened and are happening right now to someone. Something else is that I'm going to spend about half of my time here tonight telling you stories, because if you're like me, I can give you all the facts and statistics in the world, but it won't resonate with you emotionally. We learn best by sharing stories. And to take that idea one step further, I'm going to tell these stories as if you were in them. I want to invite you to identify with these people, what they go through, because once you've opened yourselves up to that kind of emotional vulnerability, you'll find that you have to do something for them. And that's really the point of this talk, to inspire you to help these people. With that in mind, the first real case scenario I have is about a young girl and you. In this story, you are a health worker trying to fight the AIDS epidemic, and you're patrolling the brothels in Mumbai, India, to ensure that they have condoms available. You go into the umpteenth brothel of the day with your police escort. The rotted out building looks like the set of a horror film, and like all the other brothels, it smells of sweat and musk, and maybe you're imagining it, but you think you detect an odor like chlorinated swimming pool water, which you know would actually be the scent of semen wafting from discarded condoms. As you go about your business asking questions and looking around, from out of nowhere, a small figure runs up to you, literally wraps her arms around you. You look down in surprise to see a little Nepalese girl, no more than 11 or 12, with shoulder-length black hair, wearing a plain black sundress. The fact that her undeveloped body is at least 4 sizes too small for her clothes emphasizes just how out of place she is there. What captures your attention the most, however, are her light brown eyes, which stare up at you with a wide, terrified expression. She tells you in a local language that you happen to speak, "Save me, save me. They are doing terrible things to me." You blink for a second or two in shock at what is happening. Your first thought is, how in the world did a kid get in this place, and what kind of a person would buy sex from her? Then you collect your wits and turn to the police officer who came with you. You say, "Okay, we're going to take this child out of here." And he replies, "No, we're not." Certain that you haven't heard him right, you say, "What do you mean, we're not? You're a police officer." And he says, "Because if we try to leave here or call for help, the brothel keepers will kill us." Your mind starts racing. Do you attempt to escape with the child and risk that the police officer is right? Do you risk staying with the girl while he goes for backup? Just how likely is it that the brothel keepers would get away with kidnapping and murdering while your escort is away? And then it dawns on you that for all you know, either this policeman or his superiors may be in the pocket of the brothel owners, and help might never arrive. You argue with the policeman a little bit more, but it doesn't take long before you decide that the uncertainties are too great and you opt to retreat. When you come back with more police, the girl, of course, is gone, and your life is changed forever. For the rest of your days, you will be ashamed and haunted by the knowledge that you have failed to save this precious and utterly helpless young child. And you know with almost certainty that soon after this encounter she was severely beaten, likely brutally gang raped, to deter her from ever attempting to escape again. And she may have even been murdered as an example to the others in the brothel. If she survived her punishment, you know that she would have continued to serve in commercialized sexual exploitation for many more years to come, until her body became either too worn out or too sick to be profitable. And chances are very high that she contracted HIV and died of AIDS within a decade of you meeting. I tell this depressing story for several reasons. First, in one form or another, this is how activists are born. It happens in that moment when all of a sudden you see that something horrific is out there and you can't turn away from it. You have to do something about it. And another reason I tell this story is to drive home the point that talking about modern slavery isn't some fun little academic exercise as some of the sex buyers I've spoken with treat it. The girl was real. The healthcare worker who met her is a friend of mine, and I can tell you that he has never recovered from his encounter. In fact, he has devoted his life ever since to fighting slavery and has helped many, many people, but he always thinks of his failure with this little girl. He was so quick to abandon her, in fact, that he never even learned her name. To give the child's memory some small measure of the dignity stolen from her, he and I agreed that we should call her something befitting who and what she was. So we decided to name her Amelia, which in Nepalese means priceless. As with so many other slaves around the world, Amolia's life was one with inestimable value that somebody bought and sold for their own selfish profit, and that someone used for their own selfish pleasure. And while my friend failed to protect her, we have failed as a global society to do whatever is necessary to protect others like her. My thesis for you tonight is that slavery happens because we let it happen. Like wolves stealing from a flock of sheep, exploiters will do what they do because they can. The question is, what are the shepherds doing? To paraphrase Josh McIntosh at the International Justice Mission, I submit that we are too concerned with trivia when we should be dealing with the greater tragedies of our world. We just don't care about these people because they aren't standing in front of us screaming for help. Amolia's story is just one kind of slavery that exists today. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about human trafficking is that all modern slavery is sex trafficking. That's not the case. Sex trafficking accounts for maybe a quarter of all the forms of slavery. It is just that sex trafficking gets talked about the most, and because of the visceral moral repugnance that we feel toward it, it deserves to get a lot of attention. So we'll talk a lot more about it later, but next I want to speak about the other 3/4 of human trafficking, which would be labor trafficking. Now, a recurring theme in human trafficking is that it involves migrant workers. Migrants are people who move from less developed areas to more developed areas looking for work. And note that this does not always involve crossing borders. People often get trafficked within their own countries, and this does not always involve illegal immigration. Legal migrants get trafficked too. And for the rest of this presentation, I'll focus mostly on Southeast Asia, because that is the region where the organizations I work with primarily operate. A lot of migrants will flow into Thailand from the surrounding countries because it's more prosperous there. So in this next story, we're going to talk about Thai fishing boats. Imagine you're a Cambodian traveling to Thailand, and you're interested in finding some type of work. You look for a few days, but then you run out of money. Eventually somebody notices your situation and says to you, "Hey friend, here's some money. I see that you need some help." You accept the money. The debt has been developed. And that is the big hook in human trafficking, because it will be used as the excuse for all the exploitation that is to follow. Next, the trafficker says, "Oh, by the way, I have this job down at the ocean. Why don't you come with me and I'll set you up. That way you can pay me back." So you go down to the shore and agree to work on a fishing boat for 2 years. They take your immigration paperwork for safekeeping, and you go out to sea. 4 years go by, and you don't touch land once. You eat rice and fish every single day. No fruits and vegetables. You work 16, 19 hours a day to keep you moving. Your captors give you stimulants, which make you tired and sloppy and prone to injury. Gradually, you notice a pattern about the treatment of your fellow slaves. If they get sick, they are thrown off the boat. If they are injured, they are thrown off the boat. If they complain too much, they are thrown off the boat. And if the captain just doesn't like them, they are thrown off the boat. So there's a lot of murder involved in this type of situation. After 4 years of this, you finally come into port to refit the ship and change out the crew. You go to the captain and say, "Can I have my pay now?" And bear in mind that he has your immigration papers, so you can't prove to anyone that you had a work permit, assuming you entered legally in the first place. The captain looks at you and says, "I'm Thai, you're Cambodian, you're in my country illegally, I don't have to pay you, go away." So now, worse off than you were 4 years ago, you go around desperately trying to find employment. Eventually somebody says, "Okay, I'll pay you if you come work for me." You go to that person's shop, you get drugged, and are put on another boat for 3 more years. That's trafficking. That's a form of slavery. And yes, that scenario actually happened to Guy. I'm not making this up. Being trafficked is a terrible thing where people lose control of their life experience for a period of time. There was another case not long ago where an individual got on a boat, no one knew where he was. He got back to Burma and found that his wife had moved on, had actually borne a child by another man because she thought he was dead. There was a story from the UN offices, this is related to us through the Mekong Club, of a young couple, Ong and his new bride Maya, who traveled from Myanmar, that's Burma, to Thailand to search for work. They had no money, so they accepted what they had been led to believe was a free ride to Bangkok. 4 hours into the journey, the van suddenly stopped. Maya was pulled out. Ong says, "What are you doing with my wife?" The traffickers say, "Well, you didn't pay us for the ride, so we're taking her. She belongs to us now. You owe us money." The traffickers beat Ong unconscious. He woke up on a fishing boat. After 4 years, he escaped, came to the UN offices because he was looking for his wife, his newlywed wife, whom he had lost, and she had presumably been taken off to a brothel somewhere. And this was just one of those terrible case scenarios where anyone who met the guy could see he was dearly in love, and his only thought on the boat must have been to find his wife and reunite. And it never happened. And this is the tragedy of human trafficking. Many, many lives are destroyed as a result of this injustice. The Thai government knows that many of these fishing boats are slave ships. They have the satellite technology to track them, but the political will is lacking to put any real effort into stopping this crime. And this is a very important point. Governments have the power to stop many forms of human trafficking. They don't invest the time, energy, and resources because too few people care enough to make them. The trafficking happens because we let it happen. And of course, this is just one industry. People get locked into similar situations in factories, construction sites, agriculture, households as domestic servants, and prostitution, just to name some of the more common arenas. Next case, you're a person traveling from Laos. You go to a Thai construction site and say, "I'd like a job." And the construction manager says, "Fine, yes, I'll give you a job, but I can't pay you for the first 2 months." Well, it isn't like you have an abundance of options. and the pay he promises is pretty good, so you agree to work for 14, 15 hours a day in hazardous conditions. 2 months go by, you say, okay, can I have my pay now? Well, the boss says, oh, well, sorry, I can't pay you for another 2 months. Just wait. And he gives you some plausible excuse about an account payable that isn't paying, that sort of thing. But then this goes on for 2 months, 2 months, 2 more months, until eventually you feel like, well, it doesn't look like I'm ever going to get paid, but if I leave, then I'm certainly not going to get paid. And so you become more anxious and rambunctious. You spent all this time away from home, you have nothing to show for it, and eventually what happens is you get into a confrontation with the foreman over how he's treating you. The police are called, they arrest and deport you. The construction manager gets a year of free labor from you. That's trafficking. That's another form of slavery. Next story. You cross over from Burma to Thailand, you find a factory near the ocean and ask, can I get a job here? And the owner says, yeah, you can have a job, but you can't leave the factory. You have to stay in the factory all the time, but we'll pay you $50 a month, which is a lot of money for a Burmese person like yourself. You're thrilled. You sign whatever papers they push at you, not knowing what they say because you can't read Thai. You go inside the factory, you work 13, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and at the end of 2 months you go to your boss and say, can I have my pay now? The factory owner says, well, according to your contract, it costs $54 to keep you here. You owe me money. It's an outrageous scam, and it happens all the time. You have indentured situations like this where the more people work, the further they fall into debt because of the ridiculous hidden costs that their exploiters impose. So they are trapped in this cycle for anywhere from months to years until either someone frees them, they escape, they get killed, the job ends, and they're set loose, or they are set loose because they're too worn out or hurt to be useful, or they get deported. This is trafficking and another form of slavery. Moving on to the exploitation of children. Imagine that you're the daughter of a struggling family in Cambodia. One day, someone you trust, a relative or community member, comes to your parents and says, let me take your child to the city. I'll see to it that she gets a good job as a house servant. She can work part of the day, go to school, and if she does well, she can even send her earnings back home. Everybody wins. Your parents jump at the opportunity. They have debts to pay, and a lot of kids that they can't feed or clothe properly. You're grateful for this arrangement because you want to help your family and to go to school. What really happens? You get taken to somebody's house. You work from 6 in the morning till 11 at night. You take care of the meals, you take care of the kids, you clean, you do laundry, you aren't allowed out of the house, you never go to school. If the man of the house wants to abuse you sexually, there's nothing you can do about it. If that happens and the woman of the house finds out, she may think that you're instigating the attention. And she'll express her jealousy through vicious beatings, a generally spiteful attitude towards you. And since you're staying in the house, your host subtracts living costs from what you're supposed to get paid. So where at first you thought you would make $30 a month to send home, you get only $5 or $1 a month, if at all. When you finally do return home, your parents are furious with you because most or all of the money they expected never arrived. And they've already been told a pack of lies about your behavior. They've heard that you were a lazy worker, that you broke expensive things, stole stuff, did poorly in school, that sort of thing. And your own parents might not believe your tales of what you've experienced because they just can't conceive of people being that awful. That's trafficking. That's another form of slavery. Continuing on with child labor. Let's jump briefly to West Africa. Anyone realize that much of the chocolate you eat is made using illegal child labor? The United Nations has documented that there are thousands and thousands of children working in dangerous conditions on cocoa plantations right now. A very large percentage of them fit the definition of trafficked slave labor. So what does this form of exploitation look like? Well, let's say that you're a 10-year-old boy who your parents indentured to work on a cocoa farm so that they can pay off a debt. Now, we tell our kids not to run with scissors, but you have to use a machete to hack your way through the jungle. You have scars crisscrossing your legs where you've hit yourself. You mix and apply pesticide chemicals without any protective gear. You sometimes have to climb way up into the trees with no safety equipment to get at the higher cocoa beans. And then you get to lug 13-pound sacks of these beans across your shoulders for long distances to a collection point. And over time, these loads can cause hernias and shoulder wounds to make... the point here is this something that you would want a child doing? And all the while you aren't going to school. Probably you are not being fed properly. Because you have no recourse to justice, the foremen feel at liberty to beat you to keep you working from dawn until dusk. In time, you have enough of these brutal conditions and you try to run away. Unfortunately, the plantation owners track you down, they bring you back, beat you up in front of the other slaves. And this is trafficking in another form of slavery. Now, one of the absolute most abhorrent abuses of children is the use of them as child soldiers. And I heard about Kony before Kony 2012 ever came out, and everything in that video is in line with what I've already learned. And this is what it looks like. You're walking on the outskirts of your village, and some people with guns come along and say to you that you've just joined their army. And to secure your loyalty, they make you kill somebody from your village. So now you're a murderer, and you can never go home. If you're a male, they teach you that it is okay to force yourself on women, treat them like slaves. If you're a girl, you can imagine what you're in for. And these groups typically use rape as a weapon to terrorize their enemies. According to the U.S. State Department's 2013 Trafficking in Persons report, child soldiers have been found in Burma, Central Africa Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The problem is that these places typically don't have many resources to trade with the Western world, so few people care about them. There's very little political will to do anything serious about these atrocities. Trafficking happens because we let it happen. State-sponsored slavery has been around since the dawn of civilization and is still very common in modern times. For example, the Japanese Empire had at least 100,000 comfort women during World War II. Some of these were there by choice. It is well documented that many were not. This photo is of some Korean nationals liberated shortly after the war. The man to the side would be a U.S. soldier assigned to take care of them. You can see that these women have not been doing very well. And speaking of state slavery, North Korea easily qualifies as one big slave state. They have a lot of very notorious re-education camps that make life a literal hell for well over 100,000 political prisoners. And we know this from satellite imagery and from the stories of refugees who make it out to friendly countries. Now, sex trafficking is such a complex and unique issue, it really deserves its own separate lecture. If you have questions about sex trafficking and prostitution, I can tell you quite a lot about this issue after the presentation. What does sex trafficking look like? Well, here is a worst-case scenario. In this story, you start out as a 12-year-old girl named Maria in Honduras. To begin with, you get raped by a group of men in your village, become pregnant. Because you are so poor, you leave your newborn with your mother and go to find some way of making money. You get to the border of a neighboring country where you meet a group of men who say they'll broker you a job in a factory, and you agree. Shortly after you cross the border, the traffickers take away your papers and they sell you to a brothel. Now, most women and girls who are forced into prostitution must have their wills broken first. This process is called by many ugly names: induction, initiation, taming, or breaking in, as though the girl were a pair of shoes. You scream at them, "No, no, no, I won't do all these horrible things you say." And what do? To convince you, they bring in 3, 4, 5, 8 guys, and they gang rape you, beat you for a day, another day, another day, however many days is necessary, until you agree to serve as Johns. And understand, this is not sensationalizing. This is how it's done to many, many girls every year. They tell you that you will remain in this hell until you have paid off your sale price in full. So at the first opportunity, you run away to a local police station. Police take you straight back to the brothel. You realize too late that they are providing protection to the brothel keepers, extorting bribes from them, getting free services from the girls. Desperately hating your situation, you try to run away once more, and this time you're found by the Army, who, when they realize that you don't have any immigration papers, they haul you back to the border. Soon as you walk across the bridge to the other side, you are picked up again by the very same group of traffickers that caught you in the first place. You are taken back to the brothel, they double your imposed debt, they give you another session of gang rapes and beatings, you lose all hope of escaping. And by this stage, you are a helpless 16-year-old girl with absolutely no recourse to justice. Every night, you give your small body up to be violated by men who never think to ask how you got where you are. They assume that you're like all other prostitutes in the trade to make some money. In fact, there are Johns who believe that it is, quote, a very unusual man indeed, one only extreme feminists believe exists, who will stand in line to be with an unwilling, scared girl as young as you. Yes, John said that to me. I'll give you the link to the discussion if you want. It's in an open forum. What they don't consider is that you have had your acting skills literally beaten into you. Now you compete with all the voluntary prostitutes to meet your quota, and failure means a punishment you'd rather not contemplate, and survival requires that you hide your fear. The only reason we even know of your story is because one night you meet a John who refuses your advances. He disarms you by asking about yourself. And sensing that perhaps he cares something for you, you tell him about what has happened. Afterward, he dances with you a little bit, pays you for your time, and you give him a warm hug before he leaves. You never learn that he is an undercover investigator going by the name of Daniel Walker, and that he is recording everything you say on a hidden camera. Very sadly, a raid to rescue you gets aborted due to corruption. So far as we know, you never get out, and we don't know the fate of your impoverished mother and child back home. And just in case there's any question, yes, Maria's story really happened. I've spoken with Daniel myself about it. You can read about more details in his book, God in a Brothel, by InterVarsity Press. Now, in the U.S., we see traffickers recruiting vulnerable girls into prostitution using a coercive lover boy type approach. This is what happened to 16-year-old Emily. Shortly after coming to the U.S. from Puerto Rico, her mother died. She was left on her own. A pimp named Steve saw Emily's situation, stepped in. First, he showered her with reassurance, affection, gifts, and then he used the emotional attachment that he had created in Emily to manipulate and bully her into selling herself in the strip joints, truck stops, and hotels along the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. In this next story, you're a 13-year-old girl named Melissa. Your Australian father has just committed suicide. Your mother has abandoned you and your two younger brothers. Desperate for money and a place to stay, you obtain a false birth certificate and you set to work at a go-go bar. You get paid a little less than $3 a night to wear heavy makeup and a bikini from 6 in the evening until 3 in the morning. You have to dance for half an hour on stage, then work the floor for a while, sitting on the knees of men, allowing them to grope and fondle you as they wish. Being a virgin, you know that you are expected to sleep with whomever is willing to pay the $900 price for being your first customer. Thankfully, after working only 5 nights, a raid that Daniel helped facilitate gets you out of this situation. And while most of the other women and girls who were rescued complained that their livelihoods have been disrupted, you are grateful. In fact, you write Daniel a card which he tells us has become a source of inspiration for him. I'll read that here. You say, "I wish that you will never be tired of helping such many children like me. I am so lucky for the opportunity that you gave. Thank you for all the help and support that you have given and shown me. I promise I will try my best to achieve all my goals in life. I'll reach for them. I'll try my best to succeed. I will never forget you, never." The sex industry preys on vulnerable people like Melissa. And of course, the managers and Johns can see that these kids are underage. To hire them on is sex trafficking and a form of slavery. To sleep with a child such as Melissa is statutory rape. But whether they're 13 or 30, I submit that these vulnerable people don't need Johns to exploit their desperation by exchanging erotic dances and sex for money. They need these men to put aside their selfishness and help get these girls out of abject poverty without accepting sexual favors in return. Some common Nepal-India scenarios. In the 2003 documentary, The Day My God Died, we hear a lot of stories of girls from Nepal who get drugged by somebody, wake up in a brothel in India. And from the Mighty Nepal shelter that figures into that documentary, we also hear this next story happening. A man will show up in a Nepalese village. He flashes some money around, says he wants a wife. He befriends a family with a pretty teenage daughter and actually marries the girl. Then he takes her down to Mumbai, India, puts her into a room while he goes to haggle a price for her. And imagine what it must feel like for her, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, when the brothel madam comes in and tells her that she has just been made a slave. Speaking of brides and trafficking, thanks to China's one-child policy, cultural preference for boys over girls, and the idea that abortion is morally acceptable, the Chinese have killed off several million girls in the womb. This has led to a massive gender imbalance in China, on the order of 18 million more men than women of marrying age. where are all these unwed men going to get their wives? Some of them are going to find ladies from the surrounding countries, and these men are typically the bottom of the barrel. The decent ones are able to attract spouses. The rest have to buy them. So now we have a human rights nightmare where the girls from North Korea, Vietnam, and others are getting trafficked to become brides. It's quite the object lesson that ideas have consequences. Now, I've seen an advocate for normalizing prostitution say that sex trafficking stories are rare anomalies. But just how many is too many? Just how many of the girls in porn, strip clubs, massage parlors, street corners, brothels, and internet adverts on sites like Backpage that are out there out of desperation or against their will? How many who are advertised as 18 are actually 16 or 13? How many have had their acting skills literally beaten into them? How many girls are performing because their pimps have threatened to harm them or their families if they don't sell themselves? How many who choose sex work are there because they have no other survivable options? How many in it have a history of sexual abuse? And I'm surprised that there are not more studies on prostitution that ask that question. Doesn't anyone think that sex abuse might seriously warp a person's perspective on what is healthy sexuality? At just what price does our society condone commercialized sex? Is prostitution the world's oldest profession? Or is it really the world's oldest oppression? And the debate deserves much more time than we have. I'll be happy to cover it later with you if you like. I will say this, at the heart of all the pro-legitimization arguments is the idea that prostitution is a victimless crime between consenting adults. That assertion, however, begs several questions. Is the significant other whom a John is cheating on not a victim? Is the future partner of a John whom he exposes to venereal disease not a victim? Are the family members who will not benefit from the money being spent on the prostitutes not victims? Are the taxpayers who must shoulder the added medical costs for treating the spread of disease through the sex industry not victims? And finally, are we so sure that the prostituted person is not a victim? Are we so sure that he or she is really an adult? And even if they are, how do we know that they are really consenting? The unavoidable fact is that there could be no sex trafficking for profit without the sex industry to hide behind. And I personally don't care if it's only 1 in 10, one trafficked girl in 10, or 1 in 100, or 1 in 1,000. The number should be 0. If we would own up to this and crush the demand, the supply for trafficked lives would stop. Let the sex buyers learn how to build relationships with people that they want to bed. They have no business paying for cheap fantasies that could end up costing somebody their freedom. Commercialized sex isn't worth the suffering it causes. And when you read case after case after case, like I have, of what happens to these people and what they live with and how it affects all the other people in their lives, you'll understand what I mean. All right, moving on. Halfway through a lecture on human trafficking, and we are finally getting to the official definition for it. This is a simplified version of the Palermo Protocol. You have 3 components. You have an act, which is either the recruitment, transport, or harboring by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. So if you have one from the first category, one from the second category, and it is for the purpose of exploitation, then it is trafficking for an adult. For a child, it's a little bit different because you don't need to determine if they were forced, coerced, or deceived. If they're a kid and they're being exploited, they're considered trafficked. Now, much of what you hear about human trafficking is related to the word trafficking, which is the movement of an individual or commodity from one place to the other. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of the word. I'd rather use the term slavery. And the reason why is that when a person doesn't get paid or loses control of their life, you call it slavery. Another thing is that activists have been using the term human trafficking for years. And in most people, it still doesn't create a sense of emotion. The word love does, the word war does, abortion does, slavery does, trafficking doesn't. So we tend to use the word slavery more often. And another reason why we prefer the term slavery is that, as you can see, it takes a long time to explain to people what human trafficking is. Also, the term gets confused with other emotionally charged topics like human smuggling, illegal immigration. The moment I say slavery, you guys have got it. On top of all this, the term trafficking places the emphasis of the crime on the person doing the recruiting, the moving, which is not necessarily the same person doing the end exploiting. And this is important because as bad as the traffickers are for delivering up folks to the slave drivers, it's the boat captains, factory bosses, construction site foremen, plantation owners, brothel keepers, heads of households who drive the demand for exploitable people. They are the real problem. Now, victims typically lured by traffickers posing as job recruiters, smugglers, even marriage brokers, and sometimes they're kidnapped, but it doesn't happen as often as people think. It's so much easier to get a person to go along with you thinking that at the end of the journey, something good is going to happen. More than half of trafficking recruiters are from the local community, frequently relatives, friends, or in some cases an intended spouse. And in order to render victims more isolated and helpless, they're moved away from the environments of people they know, preferably to where they don't speak the language. Once they arrive at their destination, their passports and documents are confiscated, and they're forced to work under the threat of starvation, deportation, rape, other physical violence, either to themselves or their loved ones back home. Trafficking in children often involves exploiting a parent's extreme poverty. You'll hear stories of parents selling their kids to pay off debts or to gain income, but because of parental love, this is actually not very common. Usually, parents part with the child that they care for because it's just too easy to convince them that a better life for their kids is out there if they'll just go with the traffickers, who's probably already somebody that they know and trust. Now, a brief word on statistics. I have been obsessing since early 2012 over the total number of trafficking victims. There are several reports and studies that I wish I had time to show you, so please see me later if you're interested in covering them. The problem with finding accurate numbers is that human trafficking is a crime, and the criminals don't want us to see what they're doing. And also, many of the victims are too ashamed and afraid to tell their stories, so it's very difficult to estimate the total human impact. That said, be careful of impossible numbers. They damage credibility, the credibility of the counter-trafficking movement, and they misdirect resources. For example, there are not 10,000 sex trafficking victims trucked in to every Super Bowl. That would make at least one prostitute for every 5 men attending. That's a ludicrous number. Likewise, there are not 100,000 to 300,000 child sex trafficking victims in the U.S. This is the number that we think are at risk for sex trafficking, not necessarily actually in it. Now, conservatively speaking, I am fully convinced that there are at least 10 million labor trafficking victims currently being exploited. For sex trafficking, despite what anyone else may tell you, there is just not enough data available to make a good estimate. I personally believe that the global number may be 1 million, 2 million, low millions. I suspect that forced prostitution victims, like what we saw with Amelia's and Maria's stories, number at least in the hundreds of thousands globally. Could be only one, could be 500,000, I don't know. As with other things, I'll be happy to walk you through how I came to these conclusions after the presentation. The best official estimate on the global number of human trafficking cases comes from a 2012 report by the United Nations International Labor Organization. They used the same statistical methods for measuring wildlife populations, and the report was peer-reviewed for quality. The number they found, 21 million trafficking victims at any given time. And to put this figure into perspective, this is more than the total number of slaves ripped from the African continent since Columbus discovered America. And here's how the numbers spread out. Roughly half are in the Asia-Pacific region. Even among the developed countries of North America, Europe, Australia, we think that they're well over 1 million. 1/4, about 4.5 million, are sex trafficking victims, 14 million are in labor trafficking, and over 2 million are in some sort of state-imposed slavery. Most sex trafficking victims are women and girls, although a small percentage are men and boys. Hagar International in Cambodia, for example, has a boys program to help young males who've been sex trafficked. It's a very underserved demographic. Overall, there are more female than male victims, we think. In human trafficking, about 15 million are adults, 5.5 million are children less than 18 years old. Half of the victims spend less than 6 months in a trafficking situation. Nearly 10% are in it for greater than 5 years. The average trafficking episode comes to about 1.5 years that way. Now, official numbers, according to the U.S. State Department, the number of prosecutions against traffickers in 2012 was 7,705, with only 4746 convictions, the vast majority of which involve sex trafficking cases, not labor. 21 million victims, less than 5,000 convictions. That's pretty good odds for the exploiters. And by the way, the total number of victims officially identified in 2012 was 46,570 people worldwide. 21 million versus 46,570. That's 450 victims for every one identified, or way less than 1% of all the victims at any given time. I'm absolutely confident that we are missing hundreds for every labor trafficking victim identified. I'm far less confident about how many we're missing on the sex trafficking side. Again, please see me afterward if you want to cover this all in detail. It has been widely reported for years that the annual profits from human trafficking are worth at least $32 billion, and that it is the third most profitable crime behind arms and drug trafficking. I cannot find how anyone came up with these figures. Also, nobody has properly studied how much we spend on dedicated counter-trafficking work. The only number anyone has even thrown out there was $350 million a year. And again, I don't know how it was calculated. The fact that we haven't researched these figures properly is just another indication to me that we aren't serious about human trafficking. But make no mistake, slavery is lucrative business. To illustrate, in many parts of the world, you can buy a girl for $100 and rent her body out over and over and over to thousands of customers until she's used up. And even after you factor in bribes and living expenses, that poor girl is going to make you a huge profit. And chances are very good that you won't ever get caught. Prevention, of course, is the preferred solution to human trafficking. The problem is that prevention is hard to do since it's difficult to measure what works. For example, you'd think that poverty reduction would be the single most effective deterrent for human trafficking, and certainly it needs to be done. But what we see is that the poorest of the poor have no money to migrate. They stay put. It's those emerging from poverty who have just enough resources and dreams for a better life who leave home. They get trafficked the most. So while I fully believe that poverty reduction is part of the solution, it's not the whole solution. Also, with the emphasis that we put on the poverty reduction, there's a tendency to think that a person's vulnerability gets them trafficked. It doesn't. People do not get trafficked because they are poor or uneducated or unable to pay for a doctor or because they are disaster victims. People get trafficked because other people exploit their vulnerability. And this is a very important distinction. As Talmadge Payne, CEO at Hagar International in Cambodia, said, poverty does not rape, poverty does not abuse. And the same problem goes for basic schooling. People absolutely need to get an education, but that is not the whole fix. In Thailand, for example, for 20 years, they kept girls in schools 2 years longer than they used to prevent them from being sex trafficked. And in the end, what they found was that these girls went to the city looking for work, couldn't compete with the better connected residents, and since the girls felt too ashamed to return home without earning money, many of them ended up in the sex industry. A lot of women with master's degrees in the Philippines are being trafficked right now because there are just not enough jobs there. The lessons learned are 1, be careful of simplistic answers to complex problems, and 2, understand that the best of intentions can bring about unintended consequences. And that said, I believe that everyone who can afford a smartphone can afford to sponsor a poverty relief program of $30 or $40 a month. There is something fundamentally wrong with our global society for not making it possible for everyone to live above the poverty line and go to school. Ever since the Industrial Revolution ended, there has been enough wealth in the world to do it. We just don't have our values and actions aligned in such a way that will make it happen. We need to educate people at risk. Potential victims need to be taught how to migrate safely. In the early days, activists would tell people don't migrate because if you do, you'll get trafficked, and that's about as helpful as telling somebody who smokes cigarettes, don't smoke or you'll get cancer. People initially hear the scary stories and maybe they're careful for a little while, but eventually they get tired of being poor and decide the risks are worth taking. We can't prevent people from migrating because they inevitably think that if something terrible is going to happen, it's going to happen to that other guy, not to me. So what you do is you teach people how to reduce the risk, know your destination, and how to get there. If you see that you're going left and you should be going right, that means something. If you feel like something's wrong, just run away. Have enough money to survive on your own for at least a month. Never let anyone have your passport, that sort of thing. It'll help some people to learn this. Educate people against the scams. In Mongolia, the way some girls get trafficked are through ads in the newspaper. And the ads say if you're single between the ages of 17 and 21, pretty, and want to make a lot of money in Japan, call us up. So say you're a beautiful Mongolian girl and you call, your family pays a whole bunch of money to a broker with the expectation that you're going to earn a lot more money. But if you ever make it to Japan, you're there for only a few weeks before you're sold over to Macau in China, that's the Vegas of the region, and you end up in the brothels and are lost. Now, one of the things that the UNIAP did about this scam was that they went out and bought a cell phone for about $25, put a whole bunch of minutes on it, and they had somebody on the other end. They put an ad in the paper next to all the other ads, which said, if you're going to call any of these other numbers, call us first. The women who were interested in modeling work called, and the educator said, no, we're not going to give you employment, but we're going to tell you about all these other ads. It was an effective prevention program because you had a potential victim at that moment interested in learning what dangerous situations those adverts could get her into. Second group of people to call were the trafficking victims who had come back, and they shared their experiences, which taught us something more. And the third category to call were the traffickers. Their phone numbers would show up on caller ID. They could be matched to their ads. That provided potential leads for law enforcement. Another approach is to educate at-risk communities. There was a girl who came back from Nepal. She was trafficked when she was 12. She made it back when she was 15. She was so angry inside that she said, I have to do something about this. So she went out with a social worker, and they would just walk from community to community, village to village, and they would stop at the place where the community's congregated. And she'd sit and tell her story. After 10 minutes, there'd be 10 people, 20 people, eventually 50 people. And at the end, somebody would raise their hand and say, oh my gosh, I had no idea this was happening. What can we do about it? And right there on the spot, they would develop a plan for the community. Not a plan that required money, but they'd come up with watch groups, sensitization schemes, educational programs. It was a simple approach, very effective. Immigration reform is another prevention step. The simple fact is that it is too expensive, it takes too long to get permission for most countries to migrate for work. So people do it illegally, and that makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Open borders will ease this problem, but not eliminate it. It doesn't stop people from getting into debt bondage with brokers who fund their trip. As much as I would like to see migrants reduce the risk, open borders creates its own set of problems. We need to address the reasons why people migrate. The reasons why people move around are diverse and they change depending upon where they live. For example, a lot of Cambodians try to get work elsewhere, not necessarily because they're especially poor, but because they want to put their kids through private school. Their public schools are substandard, so maybe fixing that would help. It is a statistical reality that we've all eaten or worn or used something that a slave helped to make. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can urge companies to ensure that their supply chains are clean. And the good news is that several of them are taking steps towards this. Instead of boycotting, boycott. Buy from the responsible businesses. For example, there are brands of chocolate in places like Trader Joe's that have the Fair Trade certification. Fair Trade is one of a growing number of nonprofit organizations that monitor supply chains to ensure their products are made in a socially responsible manner. There's a website called free2work.org that ranks over 300 companies on how well they monitor the supply chains. Ask managers at stores what it is that they're doing to ensure that there is no slavery in their products. And do it politely, of course. And as more people ask, this will be reported up to their management chain, and the CEOs will start to take notice. And if they are a large company doing business in California, they already have to have a supply chain monitoring plan in place. And there are websites out there that make it easy to send petitions. Technology, more and more, is being used to help fight trafficking and poverty. So, for example, face recognition technology is slowly improving. That will help with surveillance for missing persons. One neat idea in the works is an app for law enforcement that has a map of national flags. They show the map to potential victims. They choose their flag for their home country, and the app asks them questions in their native language. Speech recognition technology is moving on so fast that already certain apps let you transform your smartphone into a halfway decent universal translator, and these resources will only get better with time. Some groups are trying to set up a 911-like type hotline for all of Southeast Asia, and the idea would be that you would call up, and the first question that you would get is what language, and it could be very helpful to victims. Biometric screening devices like thumb readers are helping to eliminate fraud in food distribution programs. ID cards are just too easy to fake. Maybe someday they will eliminate passports altogether. And since we're talking about prevention, we'll cover some policy opportunities. Many obstacles and constraints within the counter-trafficking movement could be fixed with some policy reworking. Simply put, the counter-trafficking movement is not well coordinated. Standardized data is not being centrally collected and shared. We don't do a good job of sharing lessons learned. We don't spend enough time measuring the impact of our efforts. Funding is a constant problem. Some countries don't have laws to protect victims still from being treated as criminals. Victims' rights are not widely known by key players. As an example, for years, victims in the U.S. have been eligible for an immigration visa called the T-card, and very few people have ever gotten one. And speaking of not treating victims like criminals, Sweden has taken the idea that prostitution is a form of oppression, a form of violence against women, and so they treat prostitutes more respectfully as people needing better life options. So obviously this does not please career prostitutes. It is, however, now legal to sell sex in Sweden. The catch is that it's illegal to buy it. And this model has shown some encouraging signs of decreasing sex trafficking. So if you see this proposed in Congress, I hope you'll strongly consider supporting it. Law enforcement is supposed to take the lead on fighting human trafficking. In countries where there's a lot of corruption or limited awareness of the problem, you see private organizations like Invader, International Justice Mission, and the Freeland Foundation bridging the gap. They send undercover investigators to brothels, brick kilns, factories, construction sites, and the like with hidden cameras. And they'll capture evidence of what is going on and work with law enforcement to rescue victims, place them in aftercare, and prosecute the bad guys. A lot of people saw the 2008 movie Taken with Liam Neeson. It did for human trafficking what Pretty Woman did for prostitution. Both created a very warped picture of a very complex set of problems. Most people aren't kidnapped into sex trafficking. Most virgin girls sell for less than $1,000, not hundreds of thousands. And most trafficking organizations aren't nearly so organized that their thugs wear suits and drive yachts. People who go vigilante over human trafficking end up either in jail or dead. And rescuing people is less about busting down doors, more about serving up warrants and interviewing people afterward. And girls who get sex trafficked don't bounce back half as quickly as the daughter in Taken seemed to. Recovery can take years. And after girls have been in trafficking for more than a year, a lot of them don't even want to get out of the sex trade anymore. They have internalized their shame and don't believe that there is anything better for them economically than prostitution. So if you want to give to an intervention organization, I recommend Daniel Walker's Invader. They focus exclusively on sex trafficking, and Invader is based out of New Zealand. So if you are itemizing your taxes, look into the International Justice Mission or Freeland Foundation. International Justice Mission recently earned 4 out of 4 star rating on the Charity Navigator, and all of these organizations do very good work. And speaking of intervention, not enough people are properly trained to identify victims. So if you're a policeman, healthcare worker, educator, transportation worker like a taxi driver, just a concerned citizen, here are some signs to look for. Does the person seem anxious, fearful, paranoid, avoids eye contact, is tearful, or has signs of depression, has unexplained bruises, cuts, other signs of physical abuse, appears to be in a relationship with someone who's dominating, never alone, always has somebody translating or answering questions on their behalf, is not in control of their own finances, presents with secrecy or is unable to answer questions about where they live, inconsistent details when telling their story, has no identification such as license, passport, or other ID documents, inability to leave their job or residence, says they cannot schedule appointments, being a recent arrival to the U.S., and does not speak English, is under 18 providing commercial sex acts, or at any age unwillingly providing, is afraid of law enforcement or receiving help from an outside entity. Now, keep in mind, if you suspect somebody is being trafficked, don't just go up to them and start asking questions. You might get in the way of an undercover investigation by spooking the traffickers. Call 911 if somebody is in immediate danger. Otherwise, if you suspect something, call the human trafficking hotline. Let them know that you have a potential lead, and they will send somebody who is trained in this sort of work to look into it. Their number, you'll want to copy this, is 888-3737-888. And that said, if you do have an opportunity to talk with a suspected victim alone, these are the sort of questions you might ask. Can you leave your job or house when you want? Where did you get those bruises, or is anyone hurting you? Do you get paid for your employment? Is it fair? How many hours do you work? If a foreign national, how did you get to the U.S., and is it what you expected? Are you being forced to do anything that you don't want to do? Are you or your family being threatened? Do you live with or near your employer? Does your employer provide your housing? Are there locks and doors or windows from the outside? Do you owe debt to anyone? And if a person identifies himself as a victim, ask the person if you could help find them a safe place to go immediately. And if they need time, create an action plan. Plan with them to go to a safe place when they are ready. And then make a report to the human trafficking hotline, that 888-3737-888 number. And the hotline has language capabilities, so any individual can call directly if they choose. Restoring lives from human trafficking is expensive, resource-intensive, and time-consuming to do properly. While some victims just need a bus ticket home, a lot of them are emotionally and physically destroyed. It is the responsibility of all societies to take care of these people. An aftercare organization that is near and dear to my heart is Hagar International. They work with people who have suffered the worst forms of labor and sex trafficking, as well as other forms of abuse. Hagar helps clients until they are able to fully reintegrate into society and to earn a decent living. They've been at what they do for 20 years. They have an incredible team. Hagar operates shelters in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Their entire operation has a budget of just a little over $4 million. So just imagine the impact that you can make if you contributed to them. I strongly urge you to look them up. Transitions Global is another aftercare shelter I admire. Their founder and CEO, James Pond, has an incredible story behind how they got started. They work exclusively with teenage girls who've been sex trafficked in Cambodia, and their donation system lets you sponsor an individual young lady. Mighty Nepal also works exclusively with sex trafficking victims. They operate between Nepal and India. For those who have been saved from human trafficking, their lives, the lives of their families, may be changed dramatically and forever. And with this in mind, I want to leave you with one final story that is about what it means to rescue some of these people. The morning after one brothel raid, Daniel Walker went to see the rescued children before they were taken to their aftercare center. One social worker explained to the kids who he was, what he had done for them. And then one of the youngest girls disappeared briefly. And when she returned, she came up to him slowly and shyly handed him her only possession in the whole world, a small teddy bear. What you give to this fight may mean the world to some real person out there. I urge you to learn all that you can about human trafficking. I've collected an enormous stockpile of literature, website links, if you want me to share that. Talk about this with your friends and family. Our silence feeds this evil. As someone once said, the only thing that evil needs to succeed is for good people to do nothing. And if you see someone being exploited, report that to the authorities. Use that human trafficking hotline. Be a responsible consumer. There are letter campaigns you can join where people ask big companies what it is that they're doing to keep slavery out of their supply chains. Buy certified slave-free products whenever you have a choice. What often happens after one of these lectures is a group of young people will form a club that does fundraising. Or since this is a university, perhaps you can do serious research connected to the human trafficking field. And maybe some of you will go into a field that lets you serve with an organization directly combating slavery. Most importantly, I hope you will pick an organization like Hagar or Invader to give regularly to. They help the most abused people in the world, and they deserve all the support they can get. Lastly, keep the slaves in your thoughts. Fighting trafficking is about helping that person who is trapped in darkness, silently begging, "Save me, save me. They are doing terrible things to me." Who at this very moment suffering, and we can help make the right thing happen for. If human trafficking happens because we let it happen, it will also end because we make it end. Thank you for your time.